Hello, and welcome to the Philosophy on the Internet podcast. I am your host, Adjunct Professor Anthony David Vernon. In this series, we go over philosophy as it is being covered on various internet platforms. This episode will focus on Spotify. Now, as a starting note, much of what is being stated here also pertains to other podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts. However, I am choosing Spotify as Spotify has more established philosophy podcasts. So, on that note, let's get into philosophy on Spotify. Philosophy on Spotify is a really professional space. Even the most casual podcasts, like the now defunct Drunken Philosophy, featured a co-host who earned a master's degree in philosophy. So again, even the most casual of shows have some level of professionalism to them. That doesn't mean they necessarily have professional philosophers on them, but there seems to be an expectation of professionalism. And it seems if you want to get anywhere in the philosophy space on Spotify, you need to have some know-how of the subject. You can't go in as an amateur, you can't go in as a novice. You need to already have an understanding of philosophy. And on a similar note to that, if you want to start getting into philosophy, Spotify is not the place to start. YouTube or Reddit would be much better for this, because for Spotify, its listeners seem to already have a familiarity with philosophy, as Spotify, philosophy-wise, is for listeners who already have the familiarity. It's kind of this Ouroboros where each feeds into the other. But that being said, there are levels of casualness nonetheless. One good example of casualness is Brendan's Labyrinth. Now, this show is not really thematic, it doesn't stick with a certain branch of philosophy, but what it does typically is it covers topics being discussed on the online philosophy corners out there. It's not necessarily trying to do this, but there's a lot of episodes on Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and so this is one of those shows that you can go into without any prior background in philosophy. You don't even need to know Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson. You just simply, go in and you can get something out of Brendan's Labyrinth. Now, some of the biggest philosophy podcasts out there are also some of the easiest for philosophy novices, right? You still need some familiarity with these, perhaps, but you can do them without having a full understanding and getting something out. A good example of this is Stephen West's Philosophize This, and it's perhaps the go-to podcast for a listener who wants a simplified, general overview of the history of philosophy. Now, if you want a purely casual podcast where you still learn philosophy and even some psychology, Very Bad Wizards is the podcast. It features a University of Houston philosophy professor and a Cornell psychologist, and it's probably the most fun of the philosophy podcasts out there. There's a lot of banter, there's a lot of swearing, a lot of coverage of movies and hip-hop music, and there's just a big diversity of stuff happening on Very Bad Wizards. So it's probably the least professional, and even then it still has literal professionals, at the University of Houston and at the Ivy League level. Whereas both Brendan's Labyrinth and Stephen West Philosophize This are just straight up professional in projected tone. But these three about sum it up for the casual philosophy podcast of note. And most philosophy podcasts, in addition to all this stuff about lacking casualness, most of them are hosted by individuals with some academic background. But the previously mentioned Brendan's Labyrinth and Philosophize This are exceptions. The other really good exception to this is the Nietzsche podcast, hosted by Essential Salts or Untimely Meditations. He goes by both usernames on different platforms. But nonetheless, right, it's a really detailed podcast going into every aspect of Nietzsche's work. And so in all of that, right, most of the time though, right, even if you have podcasts that are well made by individuals without the academic background or, without current professional going ons, these shows are still well made. But traditionally, shows are hosted by, a bunch of peers who are in the field. But these shows come in all sorts of flavors. If you want a communist philosophy podcast by a bunch of Canadian PhDs, the Plastic Pill Pod is for you. If you want a more hyper detailed of the history of philosophy than what's offered by Stephen West's Philosophize This, then Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps is for you. And if you want to know about new books in philosophy, well, the New Books Network has an On the Nose podcast called New Books in Philosophy. Now, the good thing about this diversity of podcasts from different backgrounds and different degree levels is that shows also vary in length. So there's Philosophy Bites, which at the longest they get to around 20-ish minutes, a little bit over sometimes, whereas episodes of Overthink are really consistent, being always around an hour long. And then you have stuff like David Guineo's Theory and Philosophy, which can do both, where he has episodes that are like 15 minutes in length all the way up to hour-plus long episodes. And on top of all of this diversity, we also have diversity in how shows are funded and put together. Some shows are completely independent, like The Partially Examined Life, although they do have sponsorships, and others are with organizations such as the BBC's Philosophy in Our Time. And so all of this is to give a general overview of the landscape of philosophy on Spotify. I want to thank you all for your time and giving this a listen, and I want to thank Philosophy Today for hosting this episode of Philosophy on the Internet. Feel free to check out the rest of Philosophy Today's YouTube channel and go to Philosophy Today's Medium page. Adios.